October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy broadcast a special message to the nation from his office in the White House. Here is President Kennedy as he delivered that message bearing on recent events in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. By the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas, in flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947, the traditions of this nation and hemisphere, the joint resolution of the 87th Congress, the Charter of the United Nations, and my own public warnings to the Soviets on September 4th and 13th. Second, I have directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. The foreign ministers of the OAS, in their communique of October 6th, rejected secrecy on such matters in this hemisphere. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities, and I trust that in the interest of both the Cuban people and the Soviet technicians at the sites, the hazards to all concerned of continuing this threat will be recognized.
One of the reasons why this was happening was because of the presence of nuclear arms in Turkey put there by the United States. So this was a conflict between them, and this was a 13-day non-violent conflict between these two powers that was solved through communication. And this is the closest that the United States has ever come to a nuclear annihilation. At the end of this confrontation, both powers agreed to remove all of their nuclear arms from both states. That includes Turkey and Cuba.
The Soviet government publicly stated on September 11th that, and I quote, "The armaments and military equipment sent to Cuba are designed exclusively for defensive purposes," unquote. That there is, and I quote the Soviet government, "there is no need for the Soviet government to shift its weapons for a retaliatory blow to any other country, for instance, Cuba," unquote. And that, and I quote the government, "the Soviet Union has so powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites for them beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union," unquote. That statement was false.
Well, with Kennedy and Khrushchev deciding to negotiate and use diplomacy rather than threats, it allowed tensions to ease and both sides to be able to breathe a little bit easier. The Russians didn't have to worry about the nuclear weapons in Turkey. Americans did not have to worry about nuclear weapons in Cuba, and both sides realized that while there were great ideological differences, there was still room to talk, negotiate, and come to a peaceful solution rather than attack and threaten each other.
Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small. We no longer live in a world where only the actual firing of weapons represents a sufficient challenge to a nation's security to constitute maximum peril. Nuclear weapons are so destructive, and ballistic missiles are so swift, that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace.
Well, Kennedy's willingness to negotiate and compromise with the Russians, both sides removing the offending weapons, firmly established that the Cold War would be decided based upon a negotiation and at least a standoff versus breaking out into a hot war. We won't see that again, at least between the United States and Russia, for the remainder of the Cold War.
In the 1960s, there was a huge crisis called the Cuban Missile Crisis, along with the Cold War. Back in those days, in the east coast of Florida, there was a small island, a man-made island, called Peanut Island. There, the U.S. would use that little man-made island as a U.S. national bunker for President John F. Kennedy. The U.S. would use this small man-made island as a last resort for President John F. Kennedy to run the world, if necessary, from that little island.
This nation is prepared to present its case against the Soviet threat to peace and our own proposals for a peaceful world at any time and in any forum, in the OAS, in the United Nations, or in any other meeting that could be useful, without limiting our freedom of action.
How did this event affect South Florida and U.S. as a whole?
Well, as tensions rose between the United States and Cuba, the U.S. began stationing more and more troops in South Florida, and the population of South Florida became more and more uneasy with the number of troops, as well as the fears of the situation escalating with Cuba, and that began to make South Florida a very uncomfortable place to be for a while. There was a lot of fear and a lot of discomfort. Of course, you've got soldiers coming in, quickly increasing the population and overwhelming the infrastructure that was here. So that'll increase tensions as well.
How do you think the Russian civilization? How do you think Russia felt when how they knew how Turkey had missiles, U.S. missiles, right next to them?
It was probably much the same. The Russians felt that this was parity, that this was much the same thing that they were facing with a nuclear threat just miles from their border, just miles from their population, and reaction time would be minimal. And so they felt that it was merely leveling the playing field between the U.S. and Russia.
Do you think it was the right approach to take a democratic view to the situation at hand, or was it just plain out war?
Well, it was Cold War gamesmanship for sure. Just both sides ensuring that if it did come to a nuclear war, that they had the greatest advantage. They had an advantage that the other side did not. The odd thing is that neither side really wanted to use their weapons. They both feared. They both loved and feared the weapons that they were deploying.
Pretty good. Well, that was good.
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.